First of all, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. I'm always very happy to see my friends, my colleagues, who I've known for many years now. Mr. Koja, thanks to everybody for organizing this. Recep, mashallah, one of his talents is translating Turkish jokes into English. They're actually very funny, maybe even funnier in English than they are in Turkish. So you can always do this after you retire, translating into English. Okay, so my talk today is actually, there's nothing new in my talk, and that's the point of my talk. The point is that a lot of the assumptions we have about the compilers of the 6 books, the great books of Sunni tradition, are actually misunderstandings, as are a lot of what we think about literalism. So when we talk about literalism, and people use the word literally a lot, at least in English, there's actually no such thing as literalism. There's no such thing as literal meaning. Literal meaning does not exist. People think, well, literal meaning of something is, you take, let's say I say a sentence, Murtaza Hoja is wearing a tie. You take that sentence, and you just take all the context away, and you put it on a card, just write it on a card, and that's the literal meaning right there. So you go and look up the meaning in the dictionary of these words, Murtaza Hoja has a tie, and then you know what the literal meaning is. But, in fact, there's no such thing as no context. You cannot strip away context. Because if I take that sentence I just said and I just write it on a card all by itself, the reader will still provide context. You will look at this and you will bring your own assumptions about what the context is, about the background of someone named Murtaza Hoja, about what it means to have a tie on, about all these things. So humans cannot ever encounter texts without either having the context provided or bringing their own context. And then, if you say, well, you should look at the words in the dictionary and then you know their uncontested meaning, even words in dictionaries have multiple meanings, of course, and words change meaning over time. So the word, 100 years ago, maybe you don't even know what the word tie means. We use the word cravat, or something, right? So there is no such thing as literal meaning. When people talk about literalism, usually what they're trying to say is that they think that someone is interpreting a text without giving sufficient consideration to context. Without giving sufficient consideration to context, or perhaps without giving the correct consideration to context. So when someone accuses someone else of being literal or a literalist, oftentimes what they're saying is, you don't understand the context the way I think the context should be understood. Okay. Now, we all know that hadiths, assuming they've already been authenticated, so assuming they're Sahih hadiths or Hasan hadiths, they cannot necessarily be read literally. Their evident meaning has to be examined in light of a hermeneutic system that takes into consideration scope, like an, khas, right? The scope of the text. It has to take into consideration time placement, the potential aggregation or nas of the hadith, and perhaps most commonly, we have to take into consideration the style and tone of the text of the hadith. So the Prophet, his language is very hyperbolic language. It's a very hyperbolic language. Oftentimes, he accomplishes zajr, or rebuke or warning. He accomplishes this by seeming to prohibit something, or by associating a very strong threat with it. Well, in reality, he just intends to make it disliked, makruh, not necessarily haram. Hadiths must also be placed into epistemological and hermeneutic hierarchies. So certain hadiths or certain nusus, or more often principles and positions that are derived from nusus, become themselves principles through which any related hadiths must be read. Although this is an area of great contestation between the schools emerging from the Al-Hadith, namely the Hanbali and Shafi school on the one hand, and between the Hanafi school on the other, all schools engage in this. So we all, when there's Shafi, there's definitely going to get upset at Hanafis about the Hadith and Musadra, right? They say, you need to act on this hadith. And not say, no. We have, from our reading of the Quran and the hadith, we derive principles like al-kharaj bil-aman, right? The person who bears risk also is responsible for something. The person who's responsible for something also gets the benefit for it, right? But as much as Shafis like to criticize Hanafis for ignoring hadiths because they prefer to rely on legal principles, those same Shafis, for example, Imam Nawawi in his Sharh Sahih Muslim, he'll say that all hadiths that involve punishments in the afterlife have to be, for Muslims, have to be interpreted through the position that all kul al-muwahhidin yadkhuluna al-jannah. Right? So all monotheists eventually will enter heaven. So any hadith that seems to be suggesting that Muslims are punished eternally in hellfire cannot be interpreted as such. They must be interpreted through that derived hermeneutic principle, namely that all people believe in, all muwahhidin, all monotheists are going to enter heaven eventually after they're punished for their deeds. So everybody reads nusus, hadiths, through interpretive principles they've already established. Except perhaps, I was talking this yesterday with Oz Tan, about, except perhaps the Zahiris. So one of the big differences, I think, between the fiqh of Ibn Hazm and the fiqh of the Ahl Hadith is that he doesn't accept some of these nusus-derived rational principles through which the other schools of law will all read hadiths. Okay. Now, what I just discussed is not the kind of discourse we expect to find in the major Sunni hadith collections. These works were produced by basically 2 or 3 generations of scholars who belong to a tightly linked network stretching from Baghdad all the way to Transoxiana, Bukhara and Samarkand. This network in the 800s, 700s, 800s, 900s gave us the first full expressions of what the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah believe. And in fact, they gave us the title Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. So the first instance I've ever seen of the phrase Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah is in Tirmidhi Sunnah. The Jami' of Tirmidhi. He mentions it twice in the Sunnah. Okay. From the perspective of later Muslim theorists, these books of hadith were bodies of raw material that precede the interpretive reasoning that I mentioned earlier. So the famous saying attributed to Imam Abu Hanifa and others is, the hadith scholar says, "Nahnu as-sayyiduna wa hum al-atibba," right? We, the hadith scholars, are the pharmacists, and the fuqaha, they are the doctors. So we will get the medicine ready, we'll put it in, we'll make sure it's safe, we'll put it in the right containers, and it's their job to know where the medicine goes, how to use it, how to interpret it. These hadith collections were thus containers of material ripe for being taken out of context or misunderstood literally. And thus we have the trope of the supposed Salafi scholar today who opens up Sahih Bukhari or opens up Tirmidhi or opens up Bulugh al-Maram and then just acts on a hadith without understanding the proper interpretation. And indeed, these books were not works of nusus interpretation. I mean, if you open these books, of the 6 books, you will find almost no commentary from the authors, from the compilers. Bukhari's Sahih is an exception to this because in his chapter titles and his sub-chapter titles, Bukhari, rahimahullah, actually provides what he thinks your interpretation of these hadiths should be, but he does so in such a complex, in such an opaque way that generations and generations of Muslim scholars have spent a huge amount of time trying to understand what Bukhari meant in his book because he was not very clear in explaining his commentary on these hadiths. Okay. So when people talk about, when Salafis talk about we need to go back to the Sunnah of the Prophet, they're speaking about the hadith collections of the 800s. We don't actually have someone who's sitting at the time of the Prophet typing, in America, in course, you have stenographers, typing everything he said, rahimahullah, right? No one ever. what we have are these hadith collections. So that's the sunnah of the Prophet that Salafis are supposedly going back to. And when people criticize him for literalism, these are the works that they are supposedly taking out of context. What's very interesting is if you read these books, you will find a surprising number of instances in which the authors, people like Tirmidhi, Muslim, Bukhari, Abu Dawud, Nasa'i, actually provide small amounts of commentary that show that they were very aware that these hadiths could not be taken out of context. They could not be taken out of context. And first I'll start with theological issues, which I think is particularly ironic because in Tirmidhi's Jami', in the Sunnah of Tirmidhi, in the two places that he talks about the beliefs of Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah, he says it's in the context of the sifat, the attributes of God. And he says the Sunni position, the position of people like Imam Malik, Abdullah ibn Mubarak, and others, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, is that namurruha kama ja'at. We take them as they come. We read the attributes of God, His speech, His knowledge, His power. We read them as they come. We do not say Kayf hada. This is the slogan of the Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah. This is their slogan. But in his book, for example, in the hadith that the Prophet ﷺ talks about, it's a hadith Qudsi in which God says that إِذَا قَرَبَ إِلَيَّ, my slave, human being, إِذَا قَرَبَ إِلَيَّ شِبْرًا أَقْتَرَبُ مِنْهُ ذِرَاعًا. And later, وَإِذَا أَتَانِ يَمْشِي أَتَيْتُ هَرْوَلًا. If God is saying, if my servant comes to me the length of a hand, I go to him the length of an arm. If he comes to me walking, I go to him running. What does Tirmidhi himself say in his commentary on this hadith? He says, فَسَّرَ عَلَى بَعْضَ أَهْلِ الْعِلْمِ, that this, some scholars have understood this as meaning God goes to this person, يعني بِالْمَغْفِرَةِ وَالرَّحْمَةِ. So it's not literally God running, it's not literally God moving around, it's God's rahmah and maghfirah going to the person. Another example in the Sunnah of Tirmidhi. This is a very unusual hadith. It's the long hadith in which the Prophet supposedly, and I say supposedly because I'm not at all sure about the reliability of the hadith, supposedly is describing how there's different levels of the heavens and different levels of the earth, and if you go down, you can go down through different levels of the earth. And then he says at the end, وَالَذِي بِيَدْ نَفْسُ مُحَمَّدٍ بِيَدِهِ لو أنكم دليتم رجلا بحبل إلى الأرض السفلى لحبط على الله. If you get a rope and you let this person down to the lowest earth, you'll go down to God. Oh, it's interesting. Then Tirmidhi says, some scholars have said, يعني حبط على علم الله وقدرته. You will go down to the knowledge of God and God's power, not actually God. Another hadith in Jami' of Tirmidhi. It's when the people the Muslims are traveling on their camels and they're saying like Allah Akbar and they're going to speak really loud, and the Prophet ﷺ says, "Inna Rabbakum laysa bi'asam wa la ra'id." So you don't have to speak so loud. God is not deaf. He's actually between you and the front of your saddles. Well, this is interesting. And what does Tirmidhi says? He says, وَمَعْنَى قَوْلِهِ بَيْنَكُمْ وَبَيْنَ رُؤُوسِ رِحَالِكُمْ يعني علمه وقدرته. So it's not God actually between you and the front of your saddles. It's God's knowledge and His power is there. So this is Tirmidhi, who gives us the first, as far as I know, the first historical instance that survived when the term al-Sunnah was not being used. And he says, Namuru Hakramajayat, and then he gives us these commentaries. Okay. Now in terms of law, we see in both the Sunnah of Tirmidhi and the Sunnah of Abu Dawud especially, lots of instances in which Abu Dawud acknowledges that there are different frameworks in which hadith have to be placed. So, for example, in a hadith in which he says, the Prophet says, وَلَا تَسُومُوا يَوْمَ السَّبْتِ إِلَّا فِيمَا أُفْتُرِضَ عَلَيْكُمْ. don't fast on Saturday, except, you know, if it's Ramadan, then you obviously have to fast on Saturday in Ramadan. Abu Dawud says, وقال أبو داود هذا حديث منسوخ. His commentary. And another hadith that talks about على كل أهل بيت في كل عام أضحية وعتيرة. So every year, the head of the household has to slaughter one animal, and this atira. Atira is another sacrifice that was done in the beginning of Rajab. And then Abu Dawud says, وَالْعَتِيرَةُ مَنْسُوخٌ وَهَذَا خَبَرٌ مَنْسُوخ. The atira sacrifice, you don't have to do this. This was abrogated. In fact, the whole hadith is abrogated in terms of this book. And another fascinating instance in the Sunnah of Abu Dawud, and in two instances actually, I'll only give you one of them, is when he's talking about things that if they pass in front of you, break your prayer. So of course you have the controversial issue of the women and black dogs and donkeys passing in front of you. But then you have other hadiths, which Abu Dawud also includes, that say nothing breaks your prayer. Nothing breaks your prayer if it passes in front of you. So how does Abu Dawud deal with this? Again, this is not a book of fiqh he wrote. He has very, very little commentary in this book, very little discussion of the hadith, but he says, إِذَا تَعَرَضَ الْخَبَرَانِ يُنْذَرُ إِلَىٰ عَمْلِ الصَّحَابَةِ. Right? If two reports seem to contradict, what do? You look at the practice of the companions. In effect, you look at the practice and understanding of Muslim scholars. Will help you understand how to reconcile even reliable hadith that seem to be in conflict. Okay. Finally, I'll just give an example of instances in which, and some of you have taken classes with me. I'm sorry, I may have used this example before. I know Mentor was in the audience. Sorry for this Mentor. But it's an example I already gave in another class. In which Muslims, these collectors of the hadith, the compilers of the hadith collections, are also aware that hadiths have to be adjusted in their understanding based on empirical observation. So in Sahih Bukhari and also in Sunnah Abu Dawud, you have the Prophet ﷺ saying, Shahra'i la yanqusan abadan. The Ramadan wa Dhul Hijjah. 2 months in which there is a holiday. La yanqusan. What does this mean? They're never short. Ramadan and Dhul Hijjah. Of course, they understood that sometimes Ramadan is 29 days. And sometimes Dhul Hijjah is 29 days. So they knew you couldn't take this hadith literally. You had to, some people, and Bukhari says in his chapter title, he says, Bab Shahra'i la yanqusan. Qala Abu Abdullah, Bukhari. Qala Ishaq, and this is Ishaq in the right way. وَإِنْ كَانَ نَاقِصًا فَهُوَ تَمَامٌ. Even if it's not based in the sense that only has 29 days instead of 30, it's still a full month in terms of the reward you've gotten by fasting Ramadan. So in Ramadan you fast the whole month, but you only fast 29 days. In theory you're going to get less reward than if Ramadan had been 30 days. But he's saying, it's talking the wrong way to understand this hadith is meaning that even if it's 29 days, you'll still get 30 days worth of reward. And then he says, there are other people who says, لَا يَجْتَمِعَانِ كِلَاهُمَا نَاقِص. So, another theory is that in 1 year, both of them will not be 29 days. Actually, some Turkish student here, because you're much more active than my students who are called lazy, don't tell them I said that. But they go and check, are there any years when there's been Dhul Hijjah and Ramadan have both been 29 days? Maybe this year was, I have no idea, I can't remember these things. So someone can go check this out. And maybe wouldn't that be interesting if in history it's never been the case that there were these 2 months are both in office? I have no idea. Okay. So, finally the last type of example I want to give, sorry about that, is that they understood that tone and style had to be considered. So, the hadith, if آية المنافق ثلاث إذا تكلم إذا حدث كذب وإذا وعد خان وإذا وعد أخلف وإذا اؤتمن خان, right? The signs of the munafiq, the hypocrite, are 3 things. If they speak, they lie. If they make a promise, they break it. If they make a treaty, they go back on it. Or if they're given a trust, they break it. Tirmidhi, right after this hadith, he gives the explanation of Hasan al-Basri. Yani, this is nifaq al-amal, ليس نفاق الكفر. This is not the nifaq that you're talking about in the Quran, where, of course, horribly criticized and for denying the Prophet to his face and trying to undermine him, trying to have him killed, abandoning him in battle, so that the Prophet is not even allowed to pray over them when they die. Right? This is not that kind of nifaq. This is nifaq al-amal. This is instances in which your ideals and your actions don't match up. So, through his providing this report from Imam al-Hasan al-Basri, Imam al-Tirmidhi says, alerts the reader that this has to be interpreted, the tone has to be interpreted as being less severe than you might think. Or in Sunan Abu Dawood, the hadith in which the Prophet says, "Laysa minna man ghash," the person who cheats is not from amongst us. This would seem to be that someone who cheats is not a Muslim. Now this would mean that basically 95% of cab drivers in Egypt are kuffar. Right? I don't know about Turkish cab drivers, mashallah, they've always been very honest with me. So, and they have those meters. But Abu Dawood provides, right after this hadith, Abu Dawood provides the understanding, yani laysa mithlana man ghash. The person who cheats is not like a Muslim. It's not the kind of thing a Muslim should do. It's not like a Muslim to do this. So these are examples I've given from the 6 books of the authors themselves, the compilers themselves, demonstrate that they understood that hadiths have to be put into hermeneutic and epistemological frameworks. So these works were not compiled by people who did not understand that hadiths could not be taken literally. They understood they cannot be taken literally, they have to be placed in the context. Just like the
So thank you very much for your talk. So you have shown us like that there's like no such thing as literalism and or literally that view of like but where did this idea of literalism come from, or this claim about literalism or like literary approach of the societies or others, like who just created this idea? Like this
So the term literally and this idea, you know, I don't know in English we use it all the time. You know, someone will say, Donald Trump didn't say this bad thing, and you said, no, he literally said that thing, right? I mean, so oftentimes it means just someone actually said something. But the way it's used is to say that in our community, whatever group we're talking about, whoever we are, everybody understands the meaning of this text is X, right? So in effect, it means it's used to say, in our community, we accept the meaning of this thing, and you can't challenge that meaning if you want to be part of this community. So it's effectively a means of policing understanding within a community of interpretation. But there is no text that just on its own means something undebated. There are always people who could come from outside the boundaries of that community without the same assumptions, without the same access to the meaning of those words, and they would have potentially different understanding of the words.
Thank you, Professor Brown. Actually, it was very interesting. I didn't think like that, and it was a very interesting perspective. So, I want to ask you about the narration about the treatment of Prophet to his companions when they were dispatched to Beni Qurayza. And as you know, he says to not perform the Asr prayer except for in the tribe of Beni Qurayza. And as you know, on the way they are getting in conflict and getting themselves in disagreement because the dusk is coming and they need to pray. And some of them are performing the prayer and the other group was not. But in the end of history, the Prophet is not giving any bad signal to them or signal to them. So, لم يعنف عليهما. He was not harsh to any of this group. So this means that he confirmed 2 attitudes of them. So how can we read this very early example in understanding of hadith?
Yes. I would say that the way we would understand, one, potentially someone could say the Prophet was not angry at anybody because he recognized that he had not given clear instructions. For example, if this was me, and I told my children, you're not going to get dessert until you clean up your rooms, and they disagreed on what this meant, then I could say, well, I'm sorry, I was not clear enough. Right? But if we believe that the Prophet is always clear in his bayan, right, then what he has to be saying, as far as I understand it, is that he accepts a plurality of interpretation, which of course would accord with the way that Muslims have historically understood interpretation of their tradition, namely that because, first of all, there's disagreement over the authenticity of sources, so everybody agrees on the Quran, but some people think this hadith is sahih, some people think this hadith is not sahih. So because they're just going to disagree on sources, there's inevitably going to be difference of opinion interpretation. And then, of course, there's the interpretation of those texts, which also allows for disagreement. So, as far as I understand it, would simply be a prophetic precedent for the acceptance of a pluralism of interpretation